So welcome to Jetsunma's workshop on Hitchhiker's Guide to Happiness. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay our respects to elders past and present. Yep, and if you could just give a warm welcome, please, to Jetsunma, Tenzin, Palmo.
So, as presumably you're aware, the subject of our talk today is about the very fundamentals of the Buddhist path, called the Four Noble Truths. Now, how many of you have no idea what the Four Noble Truths are? Okay. How many of you are Buddhist? How many of you are not Buddhist? Okay. So, we started the beginning. After the Buddha's enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, about 2,500, 600 years ago, after his enlightenment, he spent the next 7 weeks sitting under various trees, just contemplating what he had realized and feeling that what he had realized was ultimately so subtle that nobody would understand what he was talking about. So he thought, according to traditional explanation, that it would just be a fatigue to try to explain to people, to teach people, because they won't understand. So then, after about 7 weeks of sitting under trees contemplating, traditionally the gods Brahma and Indra came to him and said, "Look, you must teach." And he said, "Nobody will understand." And they said, "No, there are some with little dust in their eyes. They will understand, so you must go." And they offered to him a wheel, a Dharma chakra, it's called the wheel of the Dharma, to turn this wheel for the benefit and the welfare of all beings. So then the Buddha went off, and he thought, well, first of all, he thought, where shall I teach? Who can I teach? Who will understand? And he remembered his former teachers who had taught him the meditation on shamatha and on attaining the material and immaterial meditative absorptions. And he thought, I'll teach them. But then he saw that they had already, both of them, passed on. And so they were not available for hearing what he had to say, his own revelation. So then he remembered the 5 ascetics that he had lived with and practiced with previously, who had then, they were at that time practicing asceticism, doing especially a lot of fasting and so forth. And then when the Buddha recognized that this severe ascetic fasting wasn't helping, it was just, degenerating the body so that the mind was not able to practice properly. It was too extreme. And he had then accepted food which had been offered to him, rice milk. Then his erstwhile companions decided he had degenerated from the true path of asceticism, and they left him. And so then he saw with his divine eye that they were now residing together near to Varanasi, which was a sacred city in India. And so from Bodh Gaya, he set out from Gaya to Varanasi. And so then it took, of course, time to walk there. But then eventually he got there, and then just outside of Varanasi, in a deer park called Shalnath, they were abiding. And when they saw him coming from a distance, they said, "Oh, there's that old Gautama who fell from the way because he couldn't manage it. So, we're ascetics and we have to be friendly, so we'll say hello. but we're not going to show him too much respect because he's fallen from the path. But then as the Buddha approached, because of his radiance, I mean, he'd just been enlightened not very long before, they just were spontaneously, they rose up, they stood up, and then they bowed down, and then they made, a seat for him to sit. And then they looked at him and said, "Wow, you're so radiant. What's happened?" And he said, "Well, I kind of attained Buddhahood since last time I saw you." And then he delivered to them what is called the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, which is the Four Noble Truths, which we're going to be dealing with very briefly today. So this set it's like the foundation on which everything else after that follows. And this is why it's so important, and this is why I felt, when they said, "What should we talk about today?" And then I thought, well, we can never have too much of the Four Noble Truths, because this sets everything. It's like if you're going to build a huge building like this, it rests on very deep foundations. If it has no foundations, it won't last. It will soon crumble. And if you have very deep, strong foundations, then the rest of the building can come up with ease and, be integrated with that deep foundational structure which upholds it all. So the Buddha's way was at that time known as the middle way. The middle way between the Buddha's life exemplified that. The Buddha's way of he was born as a prince, and so his very comfortable princely life until he left home at the age of 29, and then the other extreme of the extreme asceticism, which was very current in India at that time, and is still very current. You still see when you get gatherings of sadhus together, some stand in the sun with fires around them, in the torrid heat of India. Some stand with their hands up for years and years and years until the hand withers. Many go in for extreme, eating little, just a few grains of rice a day and so forth. So the Buddha repudiated both extremes, and extremes physically of very indulgence and asceticism, but also the extremes in view. And so, therefore, the Buddhism is called the middle way between all extremes. So what are the Four Noble Truths? So they are the truth of dukkha, the truth of the origin or cause of dukkha, the truth of the overcoming of dukkha, and the truth of the path leading to this sensation of dukkha. That's the Four Noble Truths. What is dukkha? So dukkha is a Sanskrit word and a Pali word. In Tibetan is dunga. And normally it is translated as suffering. And so, therefore, if you just read that, the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, the truth of the path leading to the sensation of suffering, it all looks very gloomy and pessimistic. And people say, but I'm not suffering. What's he talking about? Life is suffering. Actually, Buddha never said life is suffering. So this is what we're going to talk about. What does it mean? Dukkha. It's interesting, before we start, that the Buddha had, just after infinite lifetimes of striving through eons and eons of time traditionally, finally he became a supreme and perfect Buddha, which meant that his mind opened up to the full potential of what our minds can realize. All the way back, omniscience, in the sense that anything he needed to know, he could know. There is an episode in the Pali Sutras where the Buddha is walking with his monks in a forest, in a jungle, and he picks up a handful of leaves. And he says, which is more, the leaves in my hand or the leaves on these trees in the jungle? And they said, well, the leaves in your hand are so few, and the leaves in the jungle are infinite. And the Buddha said, this is compared with how much I know and how much I'm telling you. But I'm telling you what you need. The rest you don't need. It's not necessary. What you need for your liberation, that I'm telling you. That's like the leaves in my hand. The rest you don't need to know. So here he was with that incredible, his mind opened up to the fullest potential of any human mind, with the incredible sense of relief and bliss and omniscience and clarity and wisdom and compassion. And he talked about dukkha. His talk was not about bliss and love and light. His first talk was about, essentially, our human predicament. Not just human, animals, all beings who are not liberated. Our predicament. Dukkha is the opposite of the Sanskrit word sukha. Sukha means happiness, but it also is a sense of happiness in the sense of ease. Lying out in a pleasant sun with the ocean and very relaxed and very pleasant, that kind of easeful happiness. So therefore dukkha, which is the other side, means dis-ease, right? Dis-ease, because what? We are sick. The Buddha is also called the supreme physician, the supreme doctor. And so the Four Noble Truths are set out like a medical treatise. This is the disease, what we're suffering from. This is the cause of that disease. Good news, there is a cure. And this is the remedy, right? So this is what the Four Noble Truths are set out like, right? It's a prescription. So the Buddha looked straight at us and says, you're sick. Sorry, you're sick. This is the reason why you're sick. It's okay. You can recover. Your basic nature is very healthy. This is what you need to do, the treatment, in order to recover your innate good health. Right? So this is how it's set out. So the most important thing is the dukkha. What does it mean, dukkha? Dukkha is this, as I say, this underlying, everything would be all right if only. But there's always an if only. Things are never quite right, almost right. Or if they are going right, they could so easily go wrong again. So there is this underlying tension there. If we call dukkha suffering, it's too strong. Because then of course people are going to say, I'm not suffering, I'm perfectly happy. But that's missing the point, which we will understand when we understand what is the cause of this dis-ease, this underlying discomfort, non-satisfaction, which runs through our lives. Life is dukkha. And so we're always trying to deal with it so that it is not going to be dukkha. Dukkha in the sense of this sense that things are not, we're not in contact with a deeper level of deeper satisfaction. Because we do that when we come to the causes of the dukkha. What is dukkha caused by? But it's this underlying sense that things should be okay, but somehow they're not. When I was, it's hard to explain why this was important at the time, but anyway, one time, the first year that I was in, I lived up in a cave in the Himalayas in a place called Lahul. And the first year, in the winter, which normally is a very snowy time, it didn't snow, which is not good from many, many points of view. But anyway, the whole winter it didn't snow. And then in early May, some lamas came and did some puja, some rituals at a spring nearby to the nagas, to the water spirits. And after that it snowed immediately. And it snowed for a week. And so the snow got higher and higher and higher. But because it was May, then the underlying ground was not frozen anymore. And so all the under snow was coming in. So in my cave, it was dripping in everywhere and coming through the floor and everywhere. And I was living in a little meditation box, so I had to move that out to the one little place which didn't have so many drips. And meantime, I kind of got a heavy cold and felt terrible. And I remember sitting in my little box, drip, 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 cold, snowing outside, feeling terrible. Oh, they're right about not living in caves. They warned me. But I couldn't leave because everywhere was covered with snow, so I was stuck there, feeling very sorry for myself. And then I thought, didn't the Buddha say something about dukkha? And when I thought of that, I thought, well, we are in samsara. Samsara is this round of endless birth and death and rebirth and re-death and endlessly cycling round and round and round. And the very nature of samsara is dukkha. So what's the problem? When there's dukkha, there's dukkha. That's the nature of samsara. No problem. It's hard to explain. When I recognized that actually it was okay not to be okay, then, it was like taking off this rucksack, this backpack of rocks. It was all right not to be all right. I mean, if it's all right, that's nice, and when it's not all right, that's okay. I mean, this is samsara, right? This is Samsara by its nature is not so all right. It doesn't always go where we want it to go. So there's no problem. Apart, there is a problem outwardly, but inwardly there doesn't have to be a problem. We make it a problem by resenting when things don't go the way I want them to go. Right? If we just accept it, there's no problem. Do you understand? We make the problem. The ego makes the problem. Because the ego always wants things to go the way the ego wants them to go. And therefore we resent it, or we feel we're failures when things don't go the way we want them to go. But if we just accept that's the way it is, win some, lose some, so what? When it's nice, that's nice, and when it's not so nice, that's okay too, then there's no problem. And at that point, one has no sense of hope and fear. So many people are anxious and worried because we are trying to manipulate everything to go the way I want it to go. But if we just recognize that we have the inner strength to deal with anything, however it is, and it doesn't really matter that much, we can deal with it. We can use it. We can take it on the path. Then all our sense of hopes and fears begin to dissolve. It's only our sense of self which wants things to go the way I want it to go. And if anything goes not the way I want it to go, we see that as being a threat to our happiness. That's why we suffer. The suffering is not out there. The suffering is inside, our own resistance to things not being the way I want them to be. So this whole question of dukkha is, again, the Buddha said dukkha. What is dukkha? He defined it. He said dukkha is birth, old age, sickness, death. For people who are still clinging, this becomes dukkha, very unpleasant. Not getting what we want and getting what we don't want, and in brief, the fivefold aggregates that makes up the individual, that is our form and perception, sensations, karmic formations and consciousness. In other words, everything which makes up our sense of me and mine. If we cling to that, we suffer. The suffering is not out there. The suffering depends on our response to what is out there. So basically, dukkha is this sense of unease, of not getting what we want and getting what we don't want, and all the concomitant problems which come up in our life, which are dealt with from the point of view of our ego. The ego, our sense of self, of individuality, of me and mineness, creates our sense of identifying with what gives pleasure to ourselves and rejecting what we don't like. So it's this basic unease. I mean, you go look anywhere. You're on a plane, you're on a train, you're in the middle of the city, and you look at all the people, and every single one will have problems. Every single one will think, well, everything would be all right if only. If only my relationships were better, if only I had a better job, if only I was more healthy, if only this hadn't happened, if only I hadn't done that, if only so-and-so hadn't done this to me, if only I had more money, if only this, if only that. It's always something. But you know, when you go to talk to people at the beginning, okay, but then when you get to know them, it all comes out. Blah, you know. This is dukkha. And it's what we share. And so the Buddha was very practical. One of the amazing things about the Buddha was how, I often say that Buddhism is enlightened common sense. Because it's not a matter of faith. Believe, 6 impossible things before breakfast. It's not that. All of it is based on our own experience or experiences which we could have if we practiced hard enough. And so the whole format of how to practice the Dharma is that first we hear it, we read it, we study it. Intellectually, we grasp it. Then we go away and we think about it. We analyze it. We question it. Do we really understand that? What are the implications of this that I've just heard about or read? We have to think about it, question it. When we have understood and thought, yes, that sounds good, that sounds right, then we have to practice it, integrate it, become it. One Lama said just that. Well, first you study it, then you think about it, then you become it. In other words, then we have to put it into practice. If we accept that, yes, that is reasonable, that sounds right, then it's not enough to stick up here, it has to come down here. So Buddhism is infinitely practical. And you are not supposed to believe something unless you do believe it. And if you don't believe it, then go away and look at the evidence. Think about it. Question it. Talk to people who probably know more about the subject than we do. This is the point. So with dukkha, we just have to, pick up any newspaper. Turn on the television, even the so-called entertainment. It's all about dukkha. Somebody recently said that if you go to a movie, you could sit back and just pick out all the negative emotions which are being displayed in this movie. Our greed and grasping, anger, jealousy, and pride and so forth. It's all there, right? And we get caught up in the storyline, but if you sit back and just watch the mindset of these people, which is motivating their speech and their actions, then we see it's all about samsara. It's all about dukkha. And even if the hero ends up with a heroine in the end, you wait. In fact, I once read a very, and this has nothing to do with it, but I'm thinking of that. I once read a very entertaining book written by an actually well-known author about, what happens in these fairy stories after they all lived happily ever after. What happened with Cinderella and her prince and, Beauty and the Beast, and they went on for what happened after the honeymoon period. It was very funny, actually.